Imagine this. It's 1970. Muscle cars rule American streets. Gas is cheap, high-octane leaded fuel is everywhere, and horsepower is the only currency that matters in Detroit. Chevy has the Chevelle SS 454. Pontiac has the legendary GTO Judge. Dodge is terrorizing streets with the Hemi. Ford is pushing the Boss 429. And then, there's Oldsmobile. Not exactly the brand you think of when someone says Street King. Olds had the reputation of being your dad's car, your uncle's safe cruiser, the car for families. But deep inside GM's corporate machine, Oldsmobile engineers had built something that broke every rule, the 442 W30. On paper, GM said it was just 370 horsepower. Nothing crazy, nothing to challenge the Chevelle LS6 or the Hemi, but the truth was far more explosive. Because when magazines and drag racers got their hands on it, the W30 was putting down well over 420 horsepower on the dyno. It was faster than GM wanted anyone to believe, faster than Chevy wanted to admit. So why would GM lie about their own car? Why underrate the very machine that could have dominated the muscle car era? The answer takes us into a world of corporate politics, insurance scams, racing bans, and a muscle car that became a cult legend because GM never wanted you to know how powerful it really was. This is the story of the Oldsmobile 442 W30, the hidden king of GM's muscle era. Part 2, the birth of muscle car wars. To understand the W30, you need to understand where it came from. The year is 1964. Pontiac drops a bomb on the American car industry, the GTO. It wasn't the first V8 car, but it was the first to package big horsepower into a mid-size coupe, market it to young drivers, and call it a muscle car. The formula was simple. Take a mid-size car, stuff in the biggest V8 you can, make it cheap, make it loud, and make it fast. Overnight, Detroit was at war. Chevy brought the Chevelle SS. Ford answered with the Fairlane Thunderbolt, then the Mustang. Dodge had the Charger and Coronet. Plymouth had the Roadrunner. By 1966, every brand wanted in. But there was a catch. General Motors had a corporate policy that no mid-size car could have more than a 400 cubic inch engine. It was a way to control performance across divisions, or so they claimed. But in reality, it was Chevy politics. GM didn't want Oldsmobile or Buick or Pontiac to overshadow Chevrolet, the golden child of the corporation, so for years Oldsmobile played by the rules. They introduced the 442 in 1964 as a performance trim on the Cutlass. The name stood for 4-barrel carb, 4-speed, dual exhaust. It looked tough. It sounded tough. But it wasn't until the rule changed in 1970 that Olds finally had its chance to unleash its real monster. And when the gates opened, they brought the W30. 1970 was the year everything changed. 1970 was the year everything changed. GM finally dropped the 400 cubic inch ban. Suddenly, every division could go big block crazy. Chevy rolled out the 454 LS6 Chevelle rated at 450 HP. Pontiac went wild with the 455 HO. Buick introduced the legendary 455 Stage 1. And Oldsmobile, they quietly built a monster. The 1970 442 W30 came with the 455 cubic inch V8, special W30 performance parts, and a reputation for being underrated. On paper, Olds claimed 370 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, 500 lb-ft of torque at 3,600 RPM. Those were already serious numbers, but insiders knew the truth. The car was far more powerful than the brochure said. Why underrate it? Because in 1970, insurance companies had started cracking down on high-horsepower cars. If you bought a Chevelle with 450 HP, your insurance premiums were insane. But if your Olds brochure said 370 HP, suddenly you could get away with much cheaper coverage. It was a scam, and everyone in the industry knew it. But with the W30, it went even deeper than that. GM didn't just underrate it for insurance. They wanted to protect Chevy. Because if the world found out an Oldsmobile was outrunning Chevelles and GTOs, the entire hierarchy of GM would collapse. What made the W30 special wasn't just the 455, it was the entire package. The W30 option added high lift, high duration camshaft for brutal mid-range power, special carburetor and aluminum intake manifold, outside air induction, OAI, Ram Air fiberglass hood with twin scoops, special heads with better flow, low restriction exhaust manifolds, red inner fender wells, a signature Olds performance touch, upgraded distributor curve and ignition timing, lightweight parts to shave pounds off the car. The result was a muscle car that looked like a gentleman's cruiser but hit like a sledgehammer. Test drivers of the era were shocked. Magazines reported quarter-mile times in the low 13s, high 12s with minor tuning, putting it right next to Hemi's and LS6 Chevelle. And remember, this was from a car that the brochure claimed was only 370 horsepower. For comparison, Chevy Chevelle, LS6, 450 HP, Pontiac GTO Judge, 370 HP, Buick GSX Stage 1, 360 HP, Dodge Hemi, 425 HP. On the street, the Olds 442 W30 ran with all of them. In some cases, it beat them, but GM made sure the world never knew. Here's where the story gets wild. GM's official literature listed the 442 W30 at 370 horsepower. But when independent testers got their hands on it, the results didn't match the paper. Hot Rod Magazine 1970 dyno tested the W30 and found it was making closer to 420-430 horsepower. Car and Driver clocked the quarter mile in 13.3 seconds at 108 mph. Way too fast for a 370 HP car. Owners who took them to drag strips were blowing away cars that supposedly had 50-80 more horsepower on paper. So what happened? The truth is, GM was deliberately underrating horsepower. Officially, it was to control insurance costs. But unofficially, it was to make sure Chevy remained GM's top dog. Oldsmobile was never supposed to be the hero. They were supposed to be the middle-class comfort brand. But with the W30, Olds had built something that broke the rules. Something too fast, too powerful, too dangerous to market honestly. So GM lied. They slapped 370 HP on the brochure. And for decades, the truth lived underground, in drag strips, in late-night street races, and in the legends told by those who drove them. Part 6. Drag Strip Legends. Where the lie was exposed. The year is 1970. Friday night. The drag strips of America are alive. Engines rumble, the smell of burnt rubber fills the air, and young gearheads line up to see who rules the quarter mile. At the line, you expect the usual suspects. A Chevelle LS6 with its 450 horsepower rating. A Plymouth Hemi Cuda, the monster of Mopar. A Boss 429 Mustang, Ford's pride. And then, an Oldsmobile 442. Most people laugh. That's my dad's car. That's a grocery getter. But when the Christmas tree lights drop, the 442 launches like a missile. It pulls strong through first, second, and by the time the Chevelle's driver thinks he's got him, the Olds is gone. Crowds were stunned, because according to GM's own brochures, this shouldn't be happening. A 370 HP Oldsmobile wasn't supposed to outrun a 450 HP Chevelle. Yet again and again it did. On strips from New Jersey to California, word spread fast. The W30 was a sleeper, a liar, a car that carried corporate deception under its hood, and that's where the legend grew. Inside GM headquarters in Detroit, there was an unspoken rule. Chevy comes first. Chevy was the volume seller, the brand that made GM its money. Pontiac could play around, Buick could experiment, Oldsmobile could be the doctor's car. But when it came to raw performance, Chevy was the king. Or so the brass wanted. But the numbers didn't lie. When real enthusiasts compared cars, the Olds W30 was going toe-to-toe with, and sometimes beating, Chevy's golden boy, the Chevelle LS6. This didn't sit well inside GM. Imagine the tension. Engineers at Oldsmobile proud of their creation, magazine writers whispering about underrated horsepower, and Chevy executives fuming that their carefully built image was under attack by their own corporate cousin. Some insiders later admitted, if Oldsmobile had been allowed to advertise the W30's real power, it would have humiliated Chevy. That's why horsepower ratings were capped. That's why marketing was limited. Olds was never given the chance to shine in the spotlight. It wasn't just a horsepower war. It was a battle for respect inside the GM family. So why exactly did GM go to such lengths to suppress the W30? The answer lies in corporate politics. By the late 1960s, insurance companies were hunting muscle cars. Every time a new record was set on the drag strip, every time a new accident made headlines, premiums went up. So GM decided to play the game of numbers. They'd publish lower horsepower ratings, keep the feds and the insurers off their backs, and still sell cars under the table. But with Oldsmobile, the politics ran deeper. Chevy didn't just want to protect insurance buyers, they wanted to protect themselves. Oldsmobile was supposed to be a middle-market brand, not a street terror. If the W30 became too famous, it could shift buyers away from Chevy. There are stories of Olds engineers begging to take the W30 racing in official NHRA or NASCAR events, only to be told no by corporate heads. GM had already placed a ban on factory-backed racing in 1963, but Chevy always found loopholes. Olds, not so lucky. In short, Oldsmobile wasn't silenced because it wasn't good enough. It was silenced because it was too good. If GM thought they could hide the truth forever, they didn't count on the press. In 1970, Car and Driver, Hot Rod and Car Life all tested the W30, and the results were impossible to ignore. Quarter mile in 13.5 seconds. Top speed over 110 mph. Dyno readings far above 370 HP. Writers began openly questioning GM's numbers. Hot Rod flat out said, "This car feels a lot closer to 425 horsepower than 370. Enthusiasts read these magazines cover to cover. Word spread. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know, why was GM lying? Why was Oldsmobile the underdog? Why was the W30 treated like a dirty secret? This wasn't just car testing anymore. This was investigative journalism. The W30 became a case study in corporate deception, a car that forced America to question what horsepower even meant. And here's the twist. The more GM tried to bury it, the more famous the myth became. By 1971, the Oldsmobile 442 W30 had built a street reputation that no marketing campaign could buy. On Woodward Avenue in Detroit, on Van Nuys Boulevard in California, and in every small-town street race across America, the W30 earned respect the old-fashioned way, by winning. Drivers told stories of lining up against Chevelles, Hemis, Cobras, and watching the Olds pull ahead. The red inner fender wells became a symbol. If you saw them under the hood, you knew you were in trouble. Unlike the flashy Judge or the loud Roadrunner, the 442 W30 carried itself like a gentleman's car. It looked classy, almost understated, but once you pressed the gas, it became a street weapon. That dual identity made it even more dangerous. To cops, it looked like a family car. To rivals, it looked like an easy win. But those who underestimated it learned the hard way. The W30 wasn't a joke. It was a legend in disguise. By the time GM realized the myth had grown too big to contain, it was too late. The W30 had already secured its place in muscle car history, as the car that proved GM lied. Part 11. 1970. The apex of Oldsmobile power. 1970 was the year Oldsmobile threw the gloves off. GM finally lifted its corporate ban on engines larger than 400 cubic inches in intermediate cars. That meant Chevrolet could drop a 454 in the Chevelle SS, Pontiac could stuff a 455 in the GTO, Buick had its mighty 455 Stage 1, and Oldsmobile? They unleashed the 455 W30. On paper, it was rated at 370 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 500 lb-ft of torque at 3,600. But dyno sheets and track results painted a very different picture. Real output was closer to 420-430 horsepower. Test drivers from Car and Driver and Hot Rod noted that this gentleman's muscle car had enough grunt to embarrass Chevelle owners who thought Oldsmobile was just for doctors and lawyers. The W30 package wasn't just an engine swap, it was a carefully tuned system, red inner fender wells, forced air induction through the twin scoops on the fiberglass hood, a hotter camshaft, a high-flow carburetor, aluminum intake, and heavy-duty internals. It was GM engineering at its rawest, but wrapped in Oldsmobile luxury. Here was the twist. The W30 while Chevrolet advertised their Chevelle SS 454 LS6 as the king of the streets, real-world drag strip matchups often told another story. The 442 W30 could keep up, and sometimes beat it. But GM didn't want Oldsmobile overshadowing Chevrolet, their golden child. That's where the lies began. Why did GM lie about the Oldsmobile 442 W30? The answer is buried in corporate politics. Chevrolet was GM's mass-market performance arm. Pontiac had already rocked the boat with the GTO, but Oldsmobile? They were supposed to be the upscale luxury division. Cars for professionals, not street racers. If Oldsmobile suddenly became a drag strip legend, it would muddy GM's carefully crafted image. So, corporate ordered the horsepower ratings to stay artificially low. Dyno figures were adjusted. Marketing downplayed its performance. Magazine test cars were sometimes detuned before being sent out. Why? Because if Chevy guys walked into a dealership and found out an Olds could smoke their SS, the brand hierarchy would collapse. Even inside GM, engineers whispered about how much faster the W30 really was. But they were told, keep it quiet. We don't want Oldsmobile to outshine Chevrolet. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about politics, sales strategy, and protecting Chevrolet's crown. And yet, the truth couldn't stay buried forever, because drag racers were exposing it every weekend. Imagine this, it's 1970. Muscle cars rule American streets. Gas is cheap, high-octane leaded fuel is everywhere, and horsepower is the only currency that matters in Detroit. Part 13. Drag strips, dynos, and exposed lies. If GM wanted to hide the W30's real power, they failed miserably. At drag strips across America, from Detroit to California, the 442 W30 was blowing past official horsepower ratings. Stock for stock, it was running low 13s to high 12s on street tires. That wasn't supposed to happen with just 370 horsepower. Car magazines couldn't ignore it either. In 1970, Hot Rod magazine tested a 442 W30 and clocked a 13.3 second quarter mile at 106 med-ph. That was right on par with, and sometimes quicker than, the Chevelle LS6 and Hemi Cuda. Fans started asking questions. If this is only 370 horsepower, then what's Chevy really making? Did GM lie to us about all their muscle cars? This was dangerous for GM. If buyers realized horsepower ratings were manipulated, the whole muscle car credibility game could crash. So GM doubled down, sticking to their official numbers, denying the rumors, and keeping Oldsmobile classy in brochures while street racers knew the dirty truth. The W30 wasn't just a car anymore. It became a symbol of rebellion, a muscle car that defied corporate lies. Part 14. Racing controversies and NHRA shadows. The NHRA, National Hot Rod Association, added another layer to this story. In the early 70s, muscle cars were proving grounds not just on the street, but on sanctioned drag strips. The NHRA classified cars by advertised horsepower, meaning, if GM said the W30 made 370 HP, that's where it raced, which gave Oldsmobile an unfair advantage. Their 370 HP car was actually putting down 420 plus. Suddenly, NHRA racers running 442 W30s were dominating their classes. Rivals protested. Magazine articles hinted at corporate sandbagging. Chevy and Mopar fans were furious. And quietly, GM was panicking, because their own lie was now winning trophies. To calm things down, GM stopped actively supporting Oldsmobile's racing efforts. Factory help dried up. The W30 was left in the shadows, while Chevy got the spotlight. But the damage was already done. The legend of the hidden horsepower was cemented. Part 15. The cult of the W30 begins. By the mid-1970s, the muscle car era was collapsing. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, emissions regulations choked performance, and the 1973 oil crisis killed demand for big block monsters. But something unusual happened with the 442 W30. Instead of fading into obscurity, it started building a cult following. Why? Because the people who owned them knew the truth. They knew GM had lied, the numbers were fake, and that their car was faster than the brochures admitted. Stories spread through car clubs, street races, and drag strips. The W30 became the hidden king of the muscle era, not because it was the most famous, but because it was the most underrated. Oldsmobile itself was slowly retreating from performance. By 1972, compression dropped, horsepower ratings were switched to net instead of gross, and the golden days were over. But that only made the early W30s, especially the 1970 model, more mythical. In garages across America, enthusiasts preserved them, raced them, and whispered about how GM had buried their own best car. That whisper would one day turn into a roar. Part 16, 1972, the beginning of the end. 1972 marked a turning point. For the muscle car world, it was like someone flipped a switch. Compression ratios dropped, leaded fuel was on its way out, and the government forced automakers to rate horsepower in a new way, net horsepower instead of gross. Suddenly, Oldsmobile's mighty W30 went from 370 horsepower to a depressing 300 horsepower on paper. But here's the trick. The engine itself didn't change much. The real difference was the rating system. Still, to the average buyer reading brochures, the W30 looked neutered. Insurance companies piled on. A teenager walking into an Olds dealership now faced sky-high premiums just for looking at a 442. Combine that with gas prices climbing, and suddenly the W30 was no longer the dream car of the working-class hot rodder. Inside GM, executives were quietly celebrating. The 442 W30 was being strangled without them needing to kill it outright. Chevrolet once again had the performance spotlight. Oldsmobile, back to being the doctor's car, but the legend wasn't dead yet. Part 17. The lies get louder. Here's the bitter truth. GM wasn't just limiting the W30, they were actively covering it up. Oldsmobile brochures from 1972-1974 downplayed performance entirely. They emphasized luxury, ride comfort, and styling. Words like horsepower and torque disappeared. In some ads, the 442 was presented more like a personal luxury coupe than a muscle car. But ask anyone who drove one of those early 70s W30s, and they'll tell you, the engine still had teeth. Even with lower compression, even with emissions equipment, a well-tuned W30 could outrun what the ad suggested. The car was faster than its image, and that was exactly the problem. Why would GM lie louder as performance declined? Because they didn't want enthusiasts to realize Oldsmobile was still hiding speed in plain sight. The more they kept Oldsmobile in the shadows, the easier it was to crown Chevy and Pontiac as GM's performance kings. The W30 was no longer a car. It was a victim of corporate image manipulation. Part 18. Racing in the shadows. While GM pulled factory support, the streets told a different story. Local drag strips in the mid-1970s were filled with underdog Oldsmobile racers keeping the W30 spirit alive. Tuners discovered that with minor tweaks, headers, carb tuning, rear-end gearing, the 442 U30 could still hang with big Chevelles and Mopars, even in the era of emission strangulation. But here's the irony. Because GM had downplayed the W30 so heavily, rival racers underestimated it. They thought of Oldsmobile as a grandpa brand, which made it even sweeter when an Olds guy rolled up to the line, dropped the hammer, and left a Camaro or Challenger gasping for air. The NHRA still saw traces of the controversy. W30s competed in stock and superstock classes, often performing above their rated category. Racers knew it, fans knew it, GM knew it, but by then, corporate Detroit didn't care. Performance was no longer profitable. Safety, emissions, and fuel economy ruled the boardrooms. In the shadows, though, the W30 was quietly carving its myth. It was becoming the underground assassin of the muscle car world. Part 19. Forgotten but not gone. By the late 1970s, muscle cars were essentially dead. Corvettes wheezed with under 200 horsepower. Mustangs had shrunk into economy cars. And the once mighty 442, reduced to little more than a trim package on cutlasses, with stickers and stripes doing the work an engine once did. To the casual buyer, the 442 W30 was forgotten. But to hardcore enthusiasts, those early 70s cars were gold. Car clubs started forming around Oldsmobile performance, magazine articles written by enthusiasts, not corporations, began revisiting the glory days of the 1970 W30. Classified ads in the back of Hot Rod and Hemmings Motor News whispered about underrated horsepower and factory lie. The cult following wasn't mainstream yet, but a seed had been planted. To own a W30 in the late 70s was to own a secret. It was a badge of rebellion, proof you knew something the general public didn't. GM may have tried to erase its legend, but they only made it more mysterious. Part 20. The Rise of the Cult. In the 1980s. The 1980s were all about revival. Drag racing surged back. Car magazines began celebrating the lost muscle era. And collectors started hunting for the forgotten kings. Guess which car they found sitting quietly in barns and garages? The Oldsmobile 442 W30. In the 1980s, car auctions and swap meets were buzzing with stories. This thing was rated 370 HP but dynoed at 430. Olds beat Chevelles back in 70. GM buried it because it was too good. The myth had finally become legend. Street racers in the 80s even nicknamed the W30 the gentleman's Hemi killer. It wasn't as famous as the LS6 or the 426 Hemi, but that made it cooler. It was a sleeper story, a car for insiders who knew the truth. And that truth spread fast. By the late 80s, the 442 W30 had become a cult icon. Owners weren't just collectors, they were historians, keeping alive the tale of how GM lied, how Oldsmobile fought back, and how one muscle car became a buried treasure. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was justice. Part 21. The 1990s. Nostalgia awakens. By the 1990s, America was going through a wave of muscle car nostalgia. Magazines like Muscle Car Review and Hemmings Muscle Machines started reprinting drag test numbers from the 1960s and 70s. TV shows like Dream Car Garage and Barrett-Jackson Auctions were giving forgotten heroes their spotlight. And there, buried under decades of dust, the Oldsmobile 442 W30 was suddenly rediscovered. Collectors realized this wasn't just another muscle car. This was GM's buried secret. The car that had been downplayed and lied about. That mystery, that sense of being the hidden one, made it irresistible. Car clubs like the Oldsmobile Club of America grew in membership. Owners were finally treated like gatekeepers of an untold story. And while Camaros and Chevelle fetched headlines, the Olds 442 W30 started creeping up in value, like a sleeping giant stirring awake. By the late 90s, auctions were reporting pristine W30 convertibles selling for six figures. That wasn't just money, that was validation. It was America saying, "We remember you, Oldsmobile." But the timing was bittersweet, because as collectors celebrated the W30, the Oldsmobile brand itself was dying. Part 22, 2000. The Death of Oldsmobile. In December 2000, GM announced the unthinkable. Oldsmobile, the oldest American car brand founded in 1897, was being shut down. For W30 enthusiasts, it was like losing a family member. The very division that had built one of the most underrated muscle cars in history was gone. The Cutlass, the Toronado, the Aurora, all would vanish. No revival, no future, just silence. But here's the twist. The death of Oldsmobile only made the W30 more legendary. Suddenly this wasn't just a rare car, it was a relic of a dead brand. A reminder of a company that GM buried twice, once with lies in the 1970s, and again by killing the badge in 2004. Collectors leaned in harder. Owning a 442 W30 wasn't just about horsepower anymore. It was about preserving Oldsmobile's soul. Every restored W30 became a rolling time capsule. Proof that Oldsmobile once stood shoulder to shoulder with Chevy, Pontiac, and Mopar. Ironically, GM's attempt to erase Oldsmobile made the W30 impossible to forget. Part 23. The Underground Builders and Resto Mod Revolution. As the 2000s rolled into the 2010s, a new generation took hold of the W30. They weren't content to just park them in climate-controlled garages. They wanted to rebuild, reimagine, and race them again. Enter the Resto Mod era. Builders started dropping modern LS engines, fuel injection, coilover suspensions, and 6-speed gearboxes into W30s. Some purists hated it, calling it sacrilege, but others saw it as evolution, the W30's spirit. reborn with 21st century muscle. On YouTube, underground drag videos surfaced of 442 W30s shocking Hellcats, Mustangs, even Corvettes. It was déjà vu, just like the 1970s, when nobody expected an Olds to win, and yet it did. Custom shops like Ring Brothers and independent builders elevated the Olds 442 into show-stopping machines. These weren't just restorations, they were statements. Every resto mod screamed the same message. GM lied about this car once. We won't let it be forgotten again. The W30 wasn't just a cult classic now, it was an outlaw reborn. Part 24, The Modern Cult, Auctions, Legends, and Insiders. By the 2010s and 2020s, the Oldsmobile 442 W30 had fully ascended into legend. At Barrett-Jackson Mecum and R.M. Sotheby's auctions, pristine 1970 W30 convertibles started selling for over $400,000. A record-breaking price that put it shoulder to shoulder with Mopar Hemis and Chevy LS6 Chevelles. The forgotten child of GM had become one of the most expensive collector cars of its era. But here's the thing. Ask anyone outside hardcore car circles about the W30, and most shrug. They'll say, "Isn't Oldsmobile just a Cutlass?" That's what makes the cult so strong. Owning a W30 isn't mainstream. It's insider knowledge. It's belonging to a secret society of gearheads who know the truth. That GM lied, that horsepower was hidden, and that this gentleman's muscle car could run with the wildest of them. At car meets, spotting a 442 W30 is like seeing a ghost. Crowds gather. Whispers start. That's the one GM lied about. And suddenly, the car isn't just metal. It's mythology. Part 25. Why the 442 W30 still matters today. Half a century later, why does the Oldsmobile 442 W30 still matter? Because it's more than a car. It's a story. A story of corporate lies, hidden horsepower, and rebellion. A story of how a brand meant for doctors and lawyers accidentally built one of the rawest muscle cars of all time. It matters because it proves something about America itself. That truth has a way of surfacing. GM tried to bury the W30 under false numbers, politics, and silence. But enthusiasts uncovered it, drag racers proved it, collectors preserved it, and builders resurrected it. Every time a W30 fires up today, it's not just an engine roaring, it's history correcting itself. It's proof that performance can't be hidden, that passion outlives corporations, and that even a forgotten car can become immortal. The Oldsmobile 442 W30 isn't just a muscle car. It's a legend whispered in garages, shouted on drag strips, and etched into the heart of American car culture. GM lied. But the W30 told the truth, and that truth is still burning rubber today. If you loved uncovering the secrets behind America's most underrated muscle car, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the journey with Revved Tales. Don't forget to like and share this video with anyone who loves raw horsepower, forgotten legends, and the untold stories of automotive history. This is Apex from Revved Tales, and remember, in the world of cars, the truth is always faster than the lie.